All right, I think we'll get going. So we have a lot of fun material to cover today. Hi, everyone. I'm June McCartan. I'm a planner with Outwith Studio, and this is the last of our training sessions for the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. Today, we'll be focused on intuitive zoning for housing, form-based codes, and we're joined by Matt Taylor of the Central New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission, who's been involved in some form-based code work, and Ivy Van, a consulting planner who's worked around New Hampshire and has done, again, form-based code work. So excited to dive in. A lot to cover today, so we'll try to power through it and learn a lot. So just a bit on the logistics. We'll do a presentation and then a question and answer. During the Q&A, if you can raise your hand via Teams, there's a little button that you'll see that looks like a hand. And if you raise that, then it'll sort of alert us that you want to speak and we can unmute you. As always, you can ask questions via chat, either during the presentation or during the Q&A, and that you can access via a little like speech bubble looking icon. So that's sort of the basics there. Feel free to ask questions as they come, and we can sort of answer them in real time if it sort of makes sense to do so. Just a little bit about the toolbox in general. It's a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. So, we highlight those two things. There's a lot of things that communities can do to encourage housing. These are specifically focused on planning and zoning tools. So it's everything from broad planning approaches to like very specific regulatory tools. And then again, we're focused on housing production here. Housing is a broad subject, touches on a lot of different things, but the focus of the toolbox is how do we use these tools to produce more housing units. You can access the toolbox in two ways. There's a PDF that has all the tools compiled into a single document that can be printed or viewed on your computer. There's also an interactive web version, which is fun because there's sort of a filtering mechanism that we'll talk about, and then also you can share and link to individual tools, which is cool. The toolbox was put together as part of the statewide regional housing needs assessment process. So all of the RPCs sort of work together simultaneously to do their regional housing needs assessments. So this is a piece of that. It was funded through the American Rescue Plan Act, which is sort of federal funding in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and sort of how encouraging affordable housing is sort of part of that. So that's how we got funded. The toolbox process was led by a subcommittee of staff, mostly from RPCs, but also New Hampshire Housing, and facilitated by the Office of Planning and Development at the state level. There were two consultants on the project, Outwith Studio, which is where I'm from. We did sort of planning content and visual identity and sort of helped to collate the material that the RPC staff were producing, and then Boku, who did the web design. The toolbox basically goes through these tools and tries to answer a series of questions. What is it? How can it help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? What does implementation look like? And where can you learn more? So it's sort of an introductory brief on these tools, and it's meant for people working in and around local government. So whether that's local government staff and in planning staff or otherwise. But then also planning board members and select board members and legislative body members, these folks who are often doing a lot of that planning work themselves, especially in smaller jurisdictions, need this sort of like brief document to get them up to speed. And then local advocates too, like we're focused in many ways on people working in and around government officially. But also we know there's a lot of advocates on the ground, people who are invested in their communities and want to see a difference get made. And again, the goal is to just save time on upfront research, give people the basics of what they need to know, and then so point them in directions to learn more and see how they can adapt it to their community. Again, we have a sort of repeated structure through the toolbox. Sort of, we answer what is it, how can it help, getting started, which is sort of how implementation works, and then considerations, which is like nuances or questions that you might want to ask yourself and your neighbors as you sort of adapt this tool to the local context. Resources, which is handbooks and guides and sort of articles and case studies outside of this toolbox. Issues addressed, which is we wanted to do allow for some sort of filtering. Obviously, different communities are facing different issues. There might be a lot of overlap, but so every community is different, and so you can use this issues addressed piece of the toolbox to sort of filter what tools might be right for you given the challenges you're facing. And I'll touch on those a little more in a second. Related tools, that's tools within the toolbox that might work well together or sort of function similarly in some way. Sort of see how you can stack these or see what your options are. References to the state law, so where it's enabled at the state level, or there's like guardrails the state puts around it. We've got the citations there. And then case studies, which are, communities in New Hampshire and beyond in New England or elsewhere in the country that have worked with this tool and sort of used it. And we try to sort of give different types of examples. So we'll sort of preview the structure in the webinar today. I mentioned that issues addressed piece. So we've gone through and sort of named a series of issues that a lot of communities are looking to address. And on the website, you can actually just like go and filter these. We also have like a sort of matrix to help match up each tool to each issue in the PDF version. There are housing options. How do you get a diversity of housing types that meet people's needs at different life stages? Housing costs. So that's attempting in some way to lower or at least decrease the growth rate of housing costs in the sort of open market. So in the unsubsidized market, the sort of typical way many people go and buy or rent a home, how to make sure those prices stay closer to affordable. Affordable housing, sort of deed restricted affordable housing, formal affordable housing, some workforce housing, units that are often subsidized either through government programs or through cross subsidy in a sort of wider mixed income project. How to get more of those units that can be counted on the workforce housing mandate and sort of meet needs at lower income levels. Sustainable housing, so how to use land that's less resource consumptive, land consumptive, et cetera. Multi-generational options, so how do you find and produce more housing that sort of meets the everyday needs of households that have multiple generations involved, parents, grandparents, children, et cetera. Infrastructure, so many communities may find that they have a desire to produce housing but don't necessarily have the infrastructure to support it. What are the tools that can either help concentrate development where there is infrastructure or get more infrastructure funded? And then redevelopment. How can communities work with either buildings or parcels that are vacant or underutilized in some way? So today we're going to specifically talk form-based codes. These are sort of, it's a form of zoning and zoning rules that start with the building types and design elements that a community wants, and then allows those types and elements in certain areas. So, instead of going from a sort of abstract, almost mathematical rules-based approach that you see in traditional forms of zoning that sort of were developed in the early 20th century, how can we sort of go back to the fundamentals and say, all right, what types of buildings do we want? And then what do we need to do to allow those? It's often, as they're implemented, they're often used in sort of downtown or village areas to complement historic character, but that's not exclusively the case. It could happen in sort of a new, more suburban context or in a sort of industrial context where there's redevelopment happening or something like that. And one of the things it really does is it can reduce the zoning complexity for everyone, speed up housing production, and minimize unintended built outcomes because you're being very explicit about sort of what actually the goal is, from a perspective that people who aren't in the muck of planning and zoning and sort of all the like technical sort of the technical debt that we have built up that we all in planning sort of know about and can work within, and says, okay, how do real people think about this? How do people who aren't in the industry think about this? So just to sort of diagram it out a little bit, I think of it as being there's kind of two poles. There's rules and standards that we set in our law, and then there's building type and form, and traditional zoning, which is regulating things through, say, formulas like units per acre or floor area ratio, stuff like that. That's starting with this sort of rule, a sort of abstract standard, and then sort of from that generating building types and forms that conform to that sort of abstract standard, which might work out in a sort of fashion that's predictable, or it might not. And then form-based codes are sort of working from the other direction. As you start with this idea of building type and form, and then developing standards that will get to that. So it's almost a reversal of the logic of zoning, to garner more predictable outcomes. And so to illustrate this a little bit, here's sort of traditional village downtown area. This is Keene. So you can see there's variation in building heights and in building widths and ground floor heights, etc. That variation lends to a sort of it looking as not one big mass, and it being perceived as sort of different buildings. When you start to state rules and try to state this in the abstract, all right, so like maybe we can mandate that new development varies the facade and creates facade articulation, is often how it's called in rule books. Well, that could produce something that looks like this, or could it produce something that looks like this, where there is a lot of facade variation and articulation and little heights, and you got nice cornices, and it's all very looks almost right, but you can see like it's just there's something off about it. And it's like if you think about this, it's like, okay, is this room here, is that its own building? Like what's happening? It's like this uncanny valley version of traditional neighborhood development. So it's trying to create this abstract idea, almost works in theory, but it doesn't always work in reality. And sometimes this is called McMain Street development, which is kind of funny. And then sort of form-driven development, when you start with like, okay, let's, what kind of buildings do we want? How do those all work together? And this is sort of contemporary development in the West, that has started with a sort of form-based logic and sort of worked out from there. So how can it help? It can encourage alternative housing types like duplexes and small multifamily buildings by making those explicitly allowed in a form that the community is okay with. So it's, a duplex can look a bazillion different ways, and some people like some versions and they don't like other versions. And this is a way to say, okay, we kind of want this development. We want it to look in a way that matches the character of the community. Here's explicitly what we're going to tell you how to do that. And developers, sort of, especially at the smaller sort of local developer scale, can engage with that in a way that isn't cost prohibitive or confusing. It increases certainty about what is allowed where, and for developers, reduces design and permitting uncertainty. So for the community, this is great because people just sort of often are nervous about how rules are going to play out. And this is, again, just being really explicit about what the rules are, what will the outcome look like. And you can, sort of have your planning process to determine what that is. And then on the development side, this reduced design and permitting uncertainty is useful because it lowers holding costs, and then presumably, if this is done broadly in the market, then we can lower the cost of the unit for the ultimate resident. It regulates the infill, expansion, and redevelopment of downtown and village areas. I think these are some of the most prized areas that people feel strongly about. And this can produce clearer outcomes that are more in line with their vision. It can continue an historic development pattern and reflect the character of the existing community, so not sort of encouraging something that's out of character because there's, no clear guidelines around it. It encourages mixed-use development and opportunities for small business, which can be good for sort of economic development at the local level. And it can create more useful and enjoyable public spaces, especially the streets. How do we get started with implementation? If you have an ongoing master plan, this is something that you should talk about explicitly. If you don't have an ongoing master plan and form-based codes aren't talked about explicitly, sort of try to think about how form-based codes might implement the existing master plan goals. So if you have, housing production or village redevelopment as a goal, that should be thought of as part of it. Form-based codes should be connected back to that. If you're having the master plan, you can maybe connect your engagement efforts around form-based codes into that. But if not, or even if you just want to get more detail, you should have a sort of standalone form-based code engagement process where you ask the community and people who want to be involved, like, where would a form-based code be useful? What are actual design and development goals? How do we want to sort of structure this? What are the types of buildings that we think would be good? What other design elements are important? Either before or after that engagement process, you then want to start like looking at the existing building stock and specifically what might be a model for the building and design elements that you want to encourage through a form-based code, and sort of that use the existing buildings that people like and are working as a guide, and sort of also you want to catalog conditions that the code is responding to. So any sort of unique site conditions or even sort of problematic development you're looking to discourage. Then you want to sort of develop standards around those for the buildings, the public spaces, the thresholds between the two. And here's where I would maybe encourage working with an architect and or urban designer to sort of identify what are the parameters that the form-based code wants to be explicit about. Like what are you actually naming in the code that will end up being part of the law? And then using all of that draft legislation that defines the district, the standards for new development, and you also want to specify any review or permitting process. We're going to get into what these codes look like, but this can take many forms. It can be this really big overhaul, or it could be something more like surgical and tactical. Things you want to consider: implementing a form-based code may require some education on how to use it. I would say especially for the planners and developers who are already active in the community. It can often be more understandable to the general public than your current zoning. Not necessarily true. I'm not trying to knock your current zoning, but I've read a lot of zoning codes, and they're not always explicit in their vision. But for people who work in this and developers who've gotten used to this, et cetera, it might take some education on how it actually gets implemented. As you're defining parameters, and especially if you're trying to go for some sort of historicism in new development, you want to make sure that you're aligning any rules with contemporary building practices, market conditions, and goals for sustainability or accessibility. We all love the historic development, but if you're sort of begin to mandate something that is out of step with how buildings are currently built, you might either end up with something that's not accessible, not meeting your needs for your community, or you might just like stop development altogether if it doesn't match what the market's able to deliver. As I said, they take many forms. You see special districts, overlays, and alternative development incentives. So it's just a way of offering it almost a different use in, let's say, your use table, but without necessarily overriding the underlying zoning, like having it as an incentive. I've seen complete code overhauls that align everything in town with this, or it could be something called form-based light, which Ivy's going to get into in a little bit, where it's again a little more surgical in how it knits form-based ideas into your current code. And you basically just want to adapt your approach to so that the principles are there without without running into roadblocks with your current code or what have you. Standards and guidelines for architectural style and landscape can be included beyond what you might find in zoning. It's not required. You could have a separate set of design guidelines or something like that that doesn't get it into sort of mandatory questions of mandates. Or you could kind of, get into that a little more with like, types of windows, etc. Clear graphics are key. So form-based codes often are more graphical than other codes. They have more drawings to help sort of explain things, but sometimes the graphics aren't so clear. So I would say that that's an important consideration as you put a code together. You want to think about sub-districts, which you often hear called transects in sort of the form-based code community, which is like you have an overall area, maybe it's your downtown area, and sort of there might be a core to that, some transitional areas, an area that's more industrial in its existing character, and sort of you can divide the area of your form-based code into these little sub-districts to help work through those nuances. Consider what permitting regime works best. This is a lot. Form-based codes require more upfront planning and thought into what the building is actually going to look like and how it will be sited than you necessarily need for a traditional zoning code. So, where discretionary permitting might have been more necessary before, you might be able to get away with something that's a little more of an administrative review, whether that's actual by right or something that's more on the like site planning level. If the code is really explicit about what it requires, you might see the outcomes you want through a more by right regime. And in that case, you're again lowering overall development costs, which could be passed on in theory. And then consider working with a consultant. Again, so there's a lot of upfront planning for communities that don't, where their staff are already stretched thin, or they might even not have a planner on staff. There are consultants who focus on this specifically and have, methods of doing it so you're not reinventing the wheel. We have a lot of case studies in the toolbox, so I encourage you to look at those. I'll mention a few here. One is Burlington, Vermont. I'm going to focus more on the non-New Hampshire ones. One is Burlington, Vermont, which is looking at its downtown. This was getting to a code that sort of reflected the community's desires for this downtown area, the downtown waterfront, was a long process. It began, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. And so there was a range of public meetings and design charrettes, and you can see people are drawing on maps and making public comments. So there was really a big upfront engagement process. This was separate from their comprehensive planning process. This was just a standalone downtown waterfront planning process that led into this form-based code. And I sort of like their implementation because they get very explicit about building types and what they mean by those building types. So like, what is a row house? What do they mean by that? What is multifamily, large versus small? What's a perimeter building? And basically, so they have these sort of diagrammatic versions of it and definitions about what it is. And then for each zoning district within this area, they allow, townhouses, multifamily, small. So like they make this very clear definition and then relate their use table for each district back to those definitions. And I thought that was very well done. Littleton, Massachusetts, Burlington's a sort of larger city, sort of very, relatively tall downtown, all that. Littleton, Massachusetts, not that. It's sort of rural. It's, you might call it almost Boston exurban, but it still has a largely rural character and sort of in the outer stretches of what might be considered a greater Boston area. They have a sort of classic New England town common that everyone feels very strongly about. It has some classic mixed use architecture in there, but then a lot of parcels that had been turned into parking or maybe strip retail in the sort of 1950s to 60s era. And they led this process before they ever got to coding of doing scenarios. So they sort of went through what's the existing conditions and like what's development under the existing code, and then like how can we actually incorporate a more classic New England town center feeling, and sort of what might that look like under different scenarios. So they went through a whole planning process. I couldn't find any of the public meeting photos, but they had an online component too. This was maybe 2017, 2018. And then, they had that planning process. They created a vision separate. They discussed the potential of form-based code in that process, but then they ultimately decided to do that as a separate RFP and sort of did that as a standalone process. So they did create a form-based code, and it was adopted, I want to say 2020. I could be getting that wrong. And we're starting to see proposals now that sort of reflect this new development, but there's nothing built yet. That's a really nice transformative example in a place that knew what that classic character it wanted was, but hadn't seen it in many decades. And then Keene, I'll just lead off some New Hampshire examples here. Keene, again, the same photo, has a really nice, very clear set of drawings about, okay, what are the parameters we're regulating? Front setback, you see minimum and maximum building heights, block wall area, which is a concept you don't normally see in traditional zoning, but it has these very clear graphics and does it rather well to try to get just more development of the kind at once. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Matt, who's going to talk a little bit more about form-based codes and specifically some of the New Hampshire examples.
Thank you, Joe. So I have to say, when I got the request to join this webinar panel about a month ago, I wasn't thinking about form-based codes. I'm certainly not an expert on form-based codes. I did help a little bit with the section on the toolbox and had done some research. But I was actually hiking in Spain, and I was admiring some beautiful buildings, but not thinking about zoning or anything like that. But I did take a few geeky planner pictures while I was in Spain. This is one of them. I do have some pictures of gas stations too, if anybody's interested in that. But this obviously is a Burger King, and it's just outside of the medieval walled city of Plasencia, Spain. And I think this picture really helps to illustrate the importance of building form in the right context, regardless of whether it's New England or in Spain. This was outside of the gates of a medieval city, and I can tell you this building would have fit perfectly in that city. So with that, I just we'll go a little closer to home. I know June had mentioned, had talked about some examples. One of the first, or actually the first form-based code adopted in New Hampshire was in Dover, and that was adopted in 2009. It was after an extensive master plan process, which laid the groundwork. And it's according, in speaking with the planning director there, it promotes infill and flexible uses for the downtown, and it's garnered a lot of support from downtown business owners, and there's been a number of successful redevelopment projects in town, which I'm showing here. But at the bottom of the screen, is the Orpheum Apartments, which was, I believe, finished up in 2020, the construction. And for any of you that are familiar with Dover, this was the location of the former Robbins block, which I remember driving through there probably in the 1980s and 90s, and it was a little run down then. But now it's been redeveloped into 130 apartment units with commercial at the ground floor. And while the architecture may not be exactly like the building on the other corner, the bulk and the setbacks and the building itself really fits in that area. So I guess moving a little further north, another example in New Hampshire is the town of Lancaster, which is a much smaller town, a little over 3,000 people population. But it has a remarkably well-preserved downtown with mixed-use mercantile buildings from the 19th century. And there was a recognition, particularly by downtown business owners there, that this is worthy of preservation. And so again, this was after a design charrette, which I think you'll find that most of the form-based codes that have been adopted include a design charrette. I think that's a very important piece in preparation for this. And much public outreach and many public meetings of form-based code was adopted for Lancaster in 2014. And again, speaking with the town planner, she reported that the regulations have made it easier to repurpose mixed-use buildings in the downtown. These photos were taken just from this past weekend, and I can tell you they really do reflect that the buildings are well used and well taken care of, which sometimes you don't see in downtowns. So I guess in working on the form-based code section for the housing toolbox, it got me to think, how might you apply that to a small rural community? And in particular, Sutton, the town of Sutton, which the town of Sutton's a small town in central New Hampshire, a little over 2,000. It has 4 distinct villages. And like many small towns in New Hampshire, many small rural towns, that we don't often think about, but the population actually peaked in the early 1800s. In Sutton, it peaked in 1820, and it had a slow decline all the way till 1960 when it bottomed out at a population of 487. So what this has left is a legacy and a heritage of historic buildings, and there wasn't a particular need for housing for those 160 years or so when there was a population decline. But since then, like many rural communities in New England, Sutton has had a fairly significant boom in population, and it actually just it surpassed its population peak milestone of 1820 in 2010. So it took 190 years for that. But the town did receive a HOP grant, and it was to look at some character-based zoning updates. And so that's what I'm with the Regional Planning Commission, and we deal mostly with small rural towns. And so that's what we were tasked to help with. So I guess the first question, and June alluded to this, is figuring out what do small towns want. In the town of Sutton, we're fortunate there was a master plan update that was completed in 2021, and I can tell the first thing on the list. This is a snippet right from the master plan, is maintain the truly rural atmosphere of the town. And I can tell you, anyone that's probably worked or read master plans for small towns in New Hampshire, you've seen that preserve rural character. That is probably the most common thing that you will see in a master plan. Also, there's a concern about promoting historic villages, improving the town's tax base, but also there's a concern and an acknowledgement in the plan that there's a need for more a bigger variety of housing, and there's a concern about some demographic trends and an aging population in town. So I guess in looking to the master plan, I guess that kind of tells you what small towns want. Now, it's no secret really what small towns in New Hampshire need. And I'm not going to go through these bullet points. Some of these statistics are from the State Housing Needs Assessment, but we all know that there is a shortage of affordable housing in the state, and it is particularly acute in small towns in New Hampshire. So in presenting this information, and this is kind of a work in progress with Sutton. We just had a meeting last Tuesday, and we're moving on. But we presented information on demographics, looking in particular at school enrollment. This is a sensitive subject for a lot of small towns in New Hampshire. Many towns may be part of a larger school district, but they do have either an elementary school or a primary school that is really part of the town's heritage. And in the case of Sutton, they have had a school that's had at some point, I think it had all the students for all the grades, but now it's an elementary school, and the school enrollment has been declining. And you know, in some towns there have been cases actually where towns have had to close schools and consolidate because they don't have the student population to keep up with it. So I think talking with towns about demographic trends is important as part of this conversation on form-based code and housing. So the other thing that we did, and this was almost for the wow factor, but we had looked at started doing an inventory of buildings, and in this case, a pictorial inventory, which shows you that there are a lot of amazing building forms that are typical of rural New England. But the other thing that it shows you is there's some big buildings there. And if you look at demographics, population's getting older, household size is shrinking. You know, most towns it's around 2 people per household. And there are some institutional buildings in there, but they're all single family residences. In the town of Sutton, that is what is allowed, is single family residences. And so you often see, and this is common in other New England towns, you know, barns that are unused because they really don't have a purpose anymore, and outbuildings. And you see that decay in buildings because there really isn't a purpose for them anymore. So inventory was something that was important, and just looking at the forms that were in the town. So one of the things that we did, we've leaned heavily on the housing toolbox and looking at how it can help and getting started. I'm not going to go through these bullet points. I think June may have already done that. But this is a tool that can be used if you're looking at developing a code, whether it's form-based light or a full form-based code, and it really can be helpful because a lot of the research has already been done. So another important step, and this is mentioned in the toolbox, is actually doing an inventory of property characteristics of the existing built environment. And for Sutton, we had looked at lot sizes, setbacks, road frontage, and we're fortunate that we actually have an architect on the planning board who is helping to graphically depict some of this. But it's no surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise, that what's built doesn't meet the current zoning. The median lot size in Sutton Mills and the village that we're looking at is 0.4 acres, where 2 acres is actually required. Likewise, the setbacks and the road frontage didn't meet the requirements. The built environment didn't meet the requirements of the zoning. So that's a good conversation starter on what standards might be reasonable. Looking at what's there now is probably the best way to go about that. So also looked at soils and other development constraints, did some preliminary mapping. One of the things at our meeting with the Sutton Planning Board last Tuesday is they decided they would like to hire a soil scientist to do a little more work determining what might be possible for septic systems in particular, but also looking at community water systems. I should say that Sutton doesn't have a public water or a public sewer system, and it probably won't for many, many years to come, if ever. So this is certainly a concern for the town. The other information presented, and some of this actually, again, is taken from the Housing Toolbox, but what are the regulations for community systems, and what types of systems have been approved in the past? So just give some examples of how, whoops, scroll back here. So give some examples of systems that have been approved. On the right, there's a community, that's an example of a community septic system in Brentwood that was approved by DES for 27 units. And also talking about how they're regulated by the state. So the last kind of form-based approach task that we're looking at is Sutton would like to update its cluster regulations. And I think a lot of people, when they think about cluster development, they have these images of bucolic New England landscapes with farms and stone walls and fields. And I think at least from my experience, that isn't always what these cluster developments or cluster regulations produce. More often, you get single family homes with attached garages, oftentimes on cul-de-sacs, and the open space is often in the back where you really can't see it, and it's not easily accessible or used. So, and I think the piece missing in cluster developments, and I'm going to leave you, I know we haven't got a lot of time here, and I want to make sure that Ivy has a chance to talk about the nuts and bolts of form-based codes. But the thing that's missing is actually building form in our cluster regulations. And I presented this slide to the Sutton Planning Board just so they could see the possibility of what could be in rural areas. And these are two examples of historic farmhouses, classic connected New England farms with lots of buildings that have been converted for multifamily use. The one on the right is in Kentucky, 1880 farmhouse. It's near exit 6, I-89, and it has 8 multifamily units. The one on the left is in Warner, just up the way a bit, on 2 acres. Again, an existing farmhouse that's been converted to 11 multifamily units. Both of those properties have an assessed value of over $600,000. So they're certain that when you look at the value of the property, not necessarily the per unit, but it certainly exceeds the average in the community. So I want to show some possibilities and the importance of rural form as well as urban form, because we've talked a lot about urban form, but I think there are possibilities of hybrid ordinances that small towns could adopt, whether it be with your site plan regulations, with your cluster regulations, or actually a new zoning designation. But there are possibilities to incorporate that rural form into the mix. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ivy to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of form-based codes. I think you're muted too, Ivy.
Yeah. Oh, well, I had been muted because there was too much noise at my house, but now I am unmuted. Hi, I'm Ivy Van, and I've lived in New Hampshire a really long time. I'm a planner, and I've worked in a variety of places around the United States. Right now, I'm doing a lot of work in New Hampshire. Thank you, Hop Grant. And the thing that we run into all the time, I think you have to turn over the take control. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is what I refer to as form-based code light. And it incorporates a lot of things that June and Matt have already talked about. The idea, the importance of choosing your example buildings, thinking about what are the rural house forms that exist that could be adapted for either mixed use or for multifamily. And I'm going to put a plug in for a tool that you can get on the internet, which is a really great tool. This is the Place Code Beta 3.0, which is an open source character-based template code. It was developed by Principal Group in conjunction with the Congress for the New Urbanism, and it's New England specific in a lot of ways. The building forms, the building types are very much the building types that we see in New England. This is the full soup to nuts kit. It talks about street design. It talks about the public realm, which of course is facade to facade across the street, incorporating sidewalks and street furniture, how to deal with all of that. It's a really, really great tool to use. And it's a tool that I used when I developed a full form-based code for a small town in New Hampshire. So this tells you, I mean, it comes with all of the things that you need to have to make a legal code. The title, the district map, meaning and purpose, text and graphics, all of those things. This is the, oh, can I get to the next one? Yeah, there we go. So this is a residential neighborhood. And what it does is it says, these are the primary building placements. This is where they have to go, the purpose of this area, and you might designate a portion of your town or village as residential neighborhood, CD3 or T3 if you're using the transect. All of those things are really, really useful. I cannot get to the next slide. Ah, there it is. It's back. So this tells you what the building types are, accessory building types that are, and all of these are allowed by right. One of the important things to know about form-based code is you want to make that code allowed by right, because if a thing is what you want it to be easy to do. So this is an example of a duplex. And as Matt was talking about earlier, when you're doing your work to create a form-based code, you want to choose representative buildings. And people often forget, as Matt said, people forget how big buildings are in New England. That's actually a fourplex. This is what we call a sunliner. It's a stacked duplex, a really appropriate form for any part of New England. I went too far. So I think that the great thing about form-based code is that it provides certainty for everybody involved. It provides certainty for developers. If you choose one of these approved building types, you can get approved pretty easily. I recommend that you, as June said earlier in the conversation, make these administrative decisions. If they choose a building type that is appropriate for that area, make it easy for them to build it, because you want them to build that thing. It's great for dealing with, and we all deal with them, people who are terrified of any change in their neighborhood. And the important thing about choosing your example building types is to choose them from the neighborhoods who are likely to be most opposed to change. And remind them that this building already exists in their neighborhood. You know, I remember saying to people, you know, the yellow building on the corner, there's no building in this code that is any larger than that yellow building on the corner. And when you are doing public engagement and you're showing the building types, show the drawn ones like these. You have all of these available to show as building types, but also match them to a building type that is in your town. I think that's really important for getting people to see that it's not scary. It's going to be more of what we love. And planning boards and planning officials love this because it cuts down on the noise and the contention and the unpleasantness that sometimes ensues when you are trying to add housing choice to an existing town. These form-based code is wonderful for villages. Little towns that don't have a village or have only the remnants of a village, you can create a form-based code village district, which will say, okay, here is a place where we're going to allow, house-sized multifamily and house-sized mixed use. And you can draw that for people. You can make illustrations of that. You can cut and paste their existing buildings and put them into a collage and say, look, we collected all these buildings all over your town, and you could put them all adjacent to one another, and look what you have. You have a village. And in terms of economic development and making towns financially solvent, you need a village, because that's the only place in town where the cost to maintain the road is going to be less than the cost, that it's going to match what you get in taxes. It costs, everybody has heard me say this, and I'm going to say it again. It costs $4.65 a centerline foot to salt, sand, plow, ditch, and mow a single foot of road in New Hampshire every year. So if all you have is single family houses on big lots with long frontages, you are indebting your town in a way that is never going to be financially solvent, financially responsible. You need to create a village, or you need to lean into your existing village, so that you have a place in town where the tax revenue actually is more than the cost to maintain your roads. Roads are a great proxy for all of those municipal costs. I can't speak highly enough of the work that Joe Minicosi did for New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, where he did a value per acre analysis of the entire state of New Hampshire. If you look at that, you can see those villages, because those are places where they're making money for the town. They're not costing the town money. And a form-based code is a great way of making that happen without running the risk of creating strip development, out by the highway strip development, which is what we definitely do not want. So I can't speak highly enough of form-based code as a tool for that kind of thing. If you're interested in it, it's worth going to the Form-Based Code Institute and taking their classes. I think it's a series of 4 or 5 classes. They start with a 1-day and go all the way up. I think the last one I took was a 4-day, and learning all the ways that you can use a form-based code. And as Matt alluded to, one of the really great places to use them is in creating a new cluster ordinance that's going to produce a village, not a subdivision. And I think we're going to run out of time, and I'm going to go to the Q&A slide and see if there are Q's and A's. Go, go, go. There we go. Yep, too far. There we go. So do we have questions? We have somebody in the chat.
So yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. Oh, we got Scott.
Yeah.
Scott, I saw you had raised your hand. I'm just going to allow you to turn on your mic if you like.
There's something in the chat also.
I don't see any questions in the chat. That would be something we posted, and everybody who comes into the webinar, they show up there too. But so far, no questions. And I'm not sure what happened to Scott. Now there's a question.
Oh, good.
June, you want to take that one?
Yes, I'll read this out. Robert writes, we have a form-based code in our city. And after sitting on a review board, I can tell you some things to look out for. Some developers, home builders will push the envelope to accommodate internal programming. Someone has to actively push back and make sure they're in compliance with the code's intent. And fine details. Architects will sometimes present plans that include all the elements of the form-based code, but they're out of proportion or only skin deep, using brick veneer instead of actual brick. Someone needs to hold the architect accountable for those details in the form-based code to be successful. So I think those are great points, Robert. Thank you for raising those. Also, like what a wonderful experience to have to like get that granular upfront implementation experience. Beth asks, do you have examples of cluster development that is rural looking? Which town? Ooh, good question.
I can tell you about a couple of cottage developments that are not mixed use, but which are indistinguishable from 150-year-old cottage developments. There are two in Peterborough. One is 8 on an acre and looks just like Peanut Row in Harrisville, which was built in 1870. And then we have another new street, which unfortunately is a dead end. I wish it was not, but the way the houses are placed on the street and their relationship to each other very much replicates a traditional in-town street full of cottages from the 19th century. It's a really successful, and that was based on a form-based code that I wrote for the town of Peterborough. And it's form-based light, as June talked about. We said where the building had to be, what the frontage had to be, all of those things make it happen, because we said you had to have a porch, you had to step your garage back 20 feet from the front facade of the building so that you don't end up with snout houses, all of those things. And it works. I mean, we got 2 great developments out of that code. I see Michelle Decote is asking about the report. That's on the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority's website. The person who wrote it, I'm going to write his name. It's, maybe I will.
I think I found the link to it, Ivy.
Oh, you found it? Yeah. It's Joe Cozy. It's value per acre. It's a really great report, definitely worth looking at. It's a great argument for allowing what I refer to as historically appropriate development patterns. And notice the word that I did not say in that sentence of historically appropriate development pattern. We don't say density, we say that. And Joe's report shows that those historical development patterns are the most tax positive for the town. Also, they create places that people love. So, and I'm noticing all these questions about making sure that people do the right thing. I think that in a lot of ways, I mean, that example you showed, June, of the not great example of the build out, I think the more that we try to put our hands all over and say, okay, you've got to articulate your building, and you have to use different materials, and you have to use this, and you have to use that. I think that in a lot of ways, those can be counterproductive, and you end up with McMain Street instead of an actual place. So I caution people. I feel like if we can manage the mass of the building, how tall it is, how wide it is, width is a really big one, whether it has windows on the sides that the people walk beside, where the parking is, and how far it is from the back of the sidewalk or the street or road edge. Those are the really important things that determine whether a place works or not. You can make a great place out of some so-so buildings as long as they're appropriately sited. It's better if they're beautiful, but for the experience of the person walking in that place, it's really about the mass and the placement and the fenestration that makes it feel like a good place. So,
and I'll just give note that in terms of levels of review, there's there's questions of, will construction comply with the intent of the zoning? I think if the zoning is written clearly enough, you're going to get proposals that match the requirements. If they don't, there's still chances in administrative review level to catch those. Obviously, that's staff capacity, administrative capacity, whether it's planning staff or building inspector staff who's doing your sort of zoning compliance review. But it's something that would happen one way or another once we get a development proposal. The building inspector and or planning department official is going to review the plans and see that it complies. Whether or not there's a special exception or conditional use hearing. So I think it's useful to remind people that in as much as we have administrative capacity as towns and cities, there is still a level of check on the developer.
And, clear guidelines mean that that's easier for everyone. Those clear visual those clear graphics, all of that makes doing the production easier for everyone.
Well, I think there's so much here to discuss, but I also want to be respectful of folks' time. I think any follow-up questions, any of us on the panel, I'm sure, are happy to ask.
If Justin wants to email me, I'll be happy to talk to him about why snout houses are a problem, because I have opinions.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I'll just say this is we've been closing each one of these with an upcoming training list, but this is our last Toolbox training. So I know I've seen some repeat faces or names in the crowd here. So thanks for sticking with us through the month of June, and I think it's been really productive to have not only all the guests who present on all these interesting topics, but also the Q&A we get from the crowd has been really generative of like what we all need to think about as planners. So thank you all. nhhousingtoolbox.org. Check it out.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.